There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am outdoors again on a gorgeous late November, like almost December 1st morning, about 10:30 in the morning. I can't believe it's still shirt sleeves weather. It's amazing. It's such a sunny day that I'm kind of sitting in the shade, because if I sit over here, I'm going to get a sunburn. So I don't like the sun. Here with my hot coffee. I almost don't need hot coffee this morning. I am here to do another 10 books tag. The naming controversy continues. You can read the whole genealogical debacle in the show notes, but I originally named this tag Pull 10 Books Off the Shelf and Talk About Them tag, and that was a cumbersome name, so it's been renamed by absolutely everybody who's done it since then, including me. So I have now renamed it the 10 Books tag, short and sweet. But I see Steve Donahue has just posted a video where he reverted back to my original name. So I guess I won, even though I conceded the point. So this is an anti-tag. It's a catch-all tag. It's a chance to talk about books you never had a chance to talk about on BookTube before, because you read them or hauled them before you joined BookTube, or they're forthcoming books that you're curious about, or any reason whatsoever to talk about 10 books. And for example, today I don't have any physical books to go with my spiel, and that's just fine. You don't have to have the books in your possession. It could just be in your brain. So let's get started. The first one is a book that I heard the author interviewed on a podcast. The podcast itself is new to me, and it's very minimalistically titled The Books Podcast, and it is an interview with Christopher Fowler. I put the link to the podcast interview in the show notes as well. And the book is called The Book of Forgotten Authors. It's a book about exactly what the title says: once best-selling authors who have just disappeared from the cultural radar, and whatever happened to kind of thing. And I found the interview fascinating. I don't think I even finished listening to it because I got so excited about one of the books and kind of went down a rabbit hole. I have since bought the ebook. See, now my face is in so much shadow, I guess I should risk it so you can actually see me. I don't know which is better. Is this better? I think this is better. You don't want to see my face too clearly. Can I remember any of the writers other than the one I'm going to talk about next? Who else? Tom Robbins. I'm not sure Tom Robbins has completely disappeared off the cultural radar, but I guess in a sense he has. But a lot of R.M. Delafield, something Delafield, who I believe is a British female writer. But anyway, there's I don't know if each writer has their own chapter or how he's organized it, but it sounds, well, I think if I just heard about the book, I'm not sure I would be as interested as I was after listening to the interview. So do check out the interview. I think it's the kind of book that you could pick up and put down, read it in fits and starts. But the one book that he talked about, and the little tidbit of trivia that just blew me away, was a novel that I read at way too young. I think I was about 12 or 13 when I read it. Was Auntie, Mame by Patrick Dennis, which was published in 1955. Just for the record, I was not 12 or 13 years old in 1955. I read it in the late 70s or mid-70s or something, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. So it's about I guess, is he an orphan, but a young boy, parents are dead, or whatever, for whatever reason, he has to go live with his aunt, and she's quite eccentric and is kind of a socialite and kind of a fag hag, really. I think she's surrounded by gay men, and the boy, as he grows up, becomes gay, but I missed all of that, or maybe I cottoned onto it subliminally, but I remember loving the novel. I didn't know it had been made into 2 films. The first one with Rosalind Russell, I don't know anything about that, but I did see the one with Lucille Ball as Auntie Mame, and in the middle it was a musical too. But here's the piece of trivia that just blew me away. So it makes me want to reread the novel and find out more about Patrick Dennis. Patrick Dennis did eventually come out. He wasn't out when he wrote this book, per se, or anyway, but he did come out in the 1970s. But then he renounced his literary output. He'd published 3 bestsellers. I don't know anything about the other 2. But then he renounced all of that, and he became a butler. Not just any butler, but in the 1970s, especially in America, I actually don't know if he went to the UK to be a butler, because who has a butler in America, even in the 1970s? But I assume this is in America, because he became the CEO of McDonald's butler, and never kept his previous literary fame a shameful secret. That just fascinates me, so that's why I bought the book, the Christopher Fowler book. The next book I'm going to do a very brief rant on. I think you're all aware of this controversy, but my mom gave me this book as a present less than 10 years ago, and I read the book and I was very touched by it. It's called 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortenson. It came out 10 years ago. And it's about his post-September 11th, during the Afghan War, which is still with us. He started up a charity, supposedly, to build schools for girls in Afghanistan, and created this whole foundation, which became so famous. Barack Obama donated his Nobel Peace Prize money to this charity, and my mom gave money to this charity. And then there was an expose 5, 6, 7 years ago by a famous writer whose name I'm blanking on, exposing him as a fraud. He did build maybe 2 schools in Afghanistan. I don't have all the facts in my brain anymore. You can Google it very easily. He did build maybe 2 or 3 schools, but most of the money just went into his own pocket. So, if you ever see 3 Cups of Tea in a used bookstore, please deface it. Well, I would even consider buying it and using it as toilet paper. Just get it off the shelf. It's a complete immoral hoax. Next is a book that one of my best friends, she's also my cousin, Mary Jean, recommended to me when I first became an ESL teacher about a decade ago, and I never did read it. My bad. But it's a memoir called Lost in Translation, A Life in a New Language by Eva Hoffman, and she was from a Polish Jewish family. Her family survived the Holocaust somehow, and were living in post-World War II Poland, but things weren't going well, and then they emigrated to Canada. And this article I read just to prepare for this thing described the family's experience in Canada. Now, don't you Americans laugh. Memento mori, you just shut up. But they were a little put off by the bland food, quieter life, and schoolmates who hardly knew where Poland was. So, just so you Americans don't start doing a little superior dance, then she goes to university or college in Texas and found herself among people who were frightened by and hostile to her foreignness. This little blurb doesn't really talk about what my cousin described as being the central focus of this memoir, which was learning to live life in a new language, and really some really beautiful writing about how you cannot but reinvent yourself when you are speaking another tongue in a second language. So that sounds fascinating. My next pick is a novel that I read maybe just over a decade ago, and it's a Spanish novel, A Heart So White by Javier Marias, and it was published in 1992. I think I read an article in the New Yorker around that time about the writer, and that's why I read it. I didn't like this novel very much. Speaking of Memento Mori, I'm following him on Goodreads, and so just this morning I happened upon his review, and he enjoyed it more than I did, and said that it left a kind of like it better as time goes on. That hasn't happened for me, but I also don't remember very much about it. The reason I want to talk about it today is because the only memory and the only vivid experience I had reading it was this one scene which is just seared in my consciousness. The main character is a interpreter, simultaneous interpreter, high level, so he does the simultaneous interpreting for the Prime Minister of Spain. So there's this scene where the Prime Minister of Spain, who I think is fictional, they don't mention anybody's name, and I don't know Spanish political history enough to know who it might have been, but the Spanish Prime Minister is having a meeting with Margaret Thatcher, and she's described without naming her, and it's obvious who that is. And the main character is attracted to Margaret Thatcher's simultaneous interpreter. And so the two interpreters start, can I say this word? I'm going to say it, mind-fucking their political leaders and flirting with each other through how they translate what their bosses are saying to each other. So they kind of totally screw up the conversation between Margaret Thatcher and the Spanish Prime Minister because the agenda shifts to them flirting with each other. It was one of the most stunning passages I've read in any novel. The rest of the novel I thought was really dry and kind of boring and maybe not a good translation, or I have trouble with Spanish fiction for some reason, but that scene was worth the price of the book. I am very excited about this next pick. It's coming out in March 2018. If you're interested by the end of my little spiel here, I would definitely like to buddy read this. In fact, I already tentatively have a buddy read arranged with some people on Litzy. It is a novel called Bury What We Cannot Take by Kirsten Chen, and it's coming out in March next year. I don't know anything about Kirsten Chen. I'm going to guess she's Chinese American, but the story is very Chinese. And before I go any further, what first drew me to this, I think I saw something about it on Twitter, is the cover is just gorgeous. Look at this. Hey, the family are living on an island just a few hundred meters off the channel from mainland China called Drumwave Islet. I don't know if that's a real place or not. One day the two brothers, there's a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old brothers, they discover their grandmother destroying a framed portrait of Chairman Mao with a hammer. And the older brother, who's 12, is already so indoctrinated that he reports his grandmother to the authorities. So the consequence of that is that the family is given an opportunity to get visas to go to Hong Kong. This is kind of the Sophie's Choice part of the story. Oh, it's early Maoist China, so somehow they're able to finagle visas for the family to go to Hong Kong, but on one condition. One member of the family must stay behind on the island to guarantee that the family will come back someday. Well, that's the story. That sounds incredible. If you're interested in buddy reading with me sometime next winter, next spring, please let me know. I mean, again, I'm a bailer, so I may not like the writing and bail immediately, and I should probably do some more due diligence, read a free preview when they become available before I commit, but I'm certainly intrigued. Next is a 2016 novel from Canada, which had and still has so much buzz because it's the beginning of a series, and I don't read series, talk about that later, and it's sci-fi, and I don't read sci-fi. This is the only sci-fi I've read in my adult life. Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. I don't think I need to talk about it too much. Was it a BookTube darling? I have no idea. I wasn't around BookTube at the time, but it certainly was very popular on Litzy and on the bookish podcasts that I was listening to at the time. I enjoyed it a surprising amount. I think I gave it 4 stars, maybe 5. Compulsively readable. It opens with this 11-year-old girl in South Dakota going for a walk, and she falls into a big hole that's opened up in the ground near her house and lands on a giant hand the size of a car, the size of a house, I don't know how, but huge giant hand that is glowing with some kind of inner light, and it's the hand of a gigantic robot whose hand had been buried in the ground for centuries. Who knows how many years. And then she grows up to become a scientist to explore the mystery. They do carbon dating on the pieces of this humongous robot are showing up around the world, and carbon dating says it was built far earlier than any human life was on the planet, and it goes from there. The story's told in the form of memos, interview transcripts, and such. Not conventional narrative. It's very easy to read, and I really enjoyed it. The second book, so it's a series, and the second one came out this year, Waking Gods. I tried it on audio, but I thought the audio version was just rubbish. Really low production values. Like, they simulated a debate in the British House of Commons, and it was just laughably bad, the production values of that part of the audio, and I just gave up. but I may try it, reading it textually. But there's the thing about me, I'm not really into series, so I remember talking about the first volume with some friends here in Tokyo last year, and they were all so excited about the second volume coming out, and I said to them, I don't really care to find out what happens next. Like, I enjoyed the book, but I'm not really of a series guy, so maybe I'll read it, maybe I won't. But I did enjoy the first one. To pull titles for this video, I went back to some of the early books on my Goodreads TBR. I've been on Goodreads for just over 2 years, and I found stuff in the early days of my Goodreads that I had no memory of. And one of them was this gay novel from 1984 that I never read. I remember seeing paperback, pocketbook-sized editions of the American title. The author is Keith Hale, and even though the story is set in Arkansas, and I believe Keith Hale might be from Arkansas, originally published in Amsterdam in 1984 under the title, which I love this title, Clicking Beat on the Brink of Nada. And then later, a few years later, published in America under the title Cody. Now that title, I can picture that pocketbook edition, but I have never read it. I don't really know what it's about, except it's about high school boys, and it's very gay and very erotic. So where do I sign up for that? William Burroughs loved it and championed it, and I don't know anything more than that, but it's a gap in my gay canonical reading. So, and I see there's a free copy available to me on Scribd as an ebook, so I'm very curious to find out where the original title came from. Next, this was a delightful little novel that I read. I found a copy in a used bookstore in Tokyo and immediately read it, which is not something that I usually do. Usually they stay on my shelf for quite a while before I get to them, but this one just drew me to it. And as I've said before, when I go to a bookstore, used or new, my eyes always gravitate towards the titles, the authors that I've never heard anything about, so that's how I found this. This is a novel, this is a memoir by a Saudi Arabian man. He is a journalist in Paris. He has been in Paris for decades, and it's so fascinating. It's called The Belt, and his name is Ahmad Abu Daman, published in French in the year 2000, translated after that. If you're interested in this book and you like books as objects, do try to track down the edition, the softcover edition by Saki Books. I'll print the name of the title in the bottom here and also in the show notes, because it's such a beautiful book. It's printed on lusciously thick, heavy paper and just feels so wonderful in your hand. But any edition will do if you're mainly interested in the story. So this Abu Daman, he grew up in a tribal Saudi Arabian village close to the Yemen border, and it's just about his family life and community life. So many of the stereotypes you might have about what that life would have been like are really shaken by this wonderful story. There's a lot of joy, a lot of sex, a lot of love in this story. I was overjoyed to read it. There are the gender stereotypes and stuff, that's that side of the culture too, of course. But here's the tease. They have their circumcision ceremonies for the adolescent boys, and then the boys kind of are given a few days or a few weeks to recover physically. And there's this one teenage girl in this remote tribal Saudi village, this saucy teenage girl who finds them all sitting in a park or sitting under a tree and enjoying this recovery time. Now they're in pain, you know where, and she shakes her booty at them to, how do I put this, get a rise out of them so that they are in pain. Like, this is her little joke. Would you expect to encounter such a scene in a memoir of tribal village Saudi life in the 50s? Wow. Love that. Okay, the last book is on my TBR, and I had forgotten it was on my TBR. This is a novel by a Sierra Leonean Scottish writer, Aminata Forna. She was born in Scotland in 1964. I think her dad's originally from Sierra Leone, and her mom's Scottish, or the reverse. And this novel doesn't specify which West African country, but obviously, it's safe to assume it's Sierra Leone. It's about a British African woman who returns to her home country because she can inherit property, plantation, some kind of family plantation, and then it's told, the backstory is told through the lives of 4 of her aunts. Her grandfather dies at the age of 100, and he had 11 wives, and it's a story of 4 of those daughters. It's gotten quite good reviews. It was published in 2006. I want to read it. Okay, so that's the 10 books tag. If you would like to do this open-ended anti-tag yourself, you don't need my permission. Please do so. You call it whatever you want, but I'm going to tag today Steve Partridge, a new booktuber who came to BookTube via Litzy, Sasanak the Book Wizard, also Chris Bookish Cauldron, and Beyond the Pages. Those 4, but anybody else who would like to do it, please do so, and thanks for stopping by.